April 17, 1944. Dawn broke reluctantly over the tangled green mountains of northern Burma. A damp mist clung to the ridgelines, swallowing sound, muffling sight. The jungle canopy loomed like a cathedral of twisted vines and dripping leaves. For weeks, Japanese soldiers had believed this terrain was their fortress, an impenetrable barrier of steep slopes, sucking mud, and knife-edge trails where only mules could climb. Yet as the fog lifted, their ears caught something unnatural, a distant growl of engines, rising, fading, then rising again. The sound did not belong here. It was not the slow bray of pack animals or the crunch of boots. It was mechanical, steady, determined. Soon, on narrow tracks where even men stumbled, the silhouettes appeared. Open-topped machines, small yet defiant, crawling up gradients the Japanese had deemed impassable. Willys MB jeeps, coated in mud, battered by rain, their engines straining like warhorses, clawed their way up Burma's mountainsides. Soldiers of Merrill's marauders clung to them, rifles ready, faces hardened with exhaustion and resolve. To the Japanese defenders, it was unthinkable. Machines conquering slopes only goats and men were meant to traverse, and yet it was happening before their eyes. From hidden bunkers and camouflaged positions, Japanese officers raised binoculars, certain they had misjudged the scene. Perhaps the Americans had dismantled their vehicles and carried them piece by piece. Perhaps this was some illusion in the mist. But no, the growling engines told the truth. Jeeps, hundreds of them, swarmed across ridges like steel insects, slipping, spinning, yet never halting. Their tires clawed through clay and gravel. When one stalled, men pushed, cursed and dragged it upward, until engines roared again. The jungle fortress was breached not by armored tanks or thunderous artillery, but by something far smaller, far more humble, a quarter-ton vehicle born in Detroit, carried across oceans, and now proving its mettle on the roof of Southeast Asia. The Japanese defenders watched, stunned. Their strategy had depended on terrain, on the certainty that Allied supply lines would collapse in the jungle's chokehold. They knew that rivers were swollen with monsoon rains, that ridges were knife-thin, and that trails dissolved into muck. They believed mobility belonged only to them, that they alone could vanish into bamboo and reappear like ghosts in the canopy. For 2 years they had fought with that confidence, but as the jeeps crawled into view, headlights dimmed, radiators hissing, a new reality unfolded. The Americans had found a way to bring their machines into the jungle heartland. It was not supposed to be possible, and yet the impossible was rumbling up the slopes. The scene that day was not a single anomaly. It was the beginning of a pattern, a creeping realization that the war in Burma was shifting. Where once the Japanese had used the terrain as a weapon, now it turned against them. Their fortresses in the hills were vulnerable, their ambush points exposed, their confidence shaken. American jeeps, lightweight, agile, and seemingly indestructible, became the spearhead of an advance through landscapes that history had labeled impassable. The very mountains the Japanese believed would save them now echoed with the sound of Allied engines. Consider what these soldiers saw from their dugouts. Jeeps fording swollen streams with canvas stretched over engines to keep the water out. Jeeps towing supply trailers up tracks hacked into the jungle, carrying crates of ammunition, sacks of rice, even portable radios that could whisper orders across valleys. Jeeps with mounted, 30-caliber machine guns, their barrels cutting arcs through the mist, ready to spit fire at any sudden silhouette in the tree line. These were not just vehicles, they were lifelines. To Allied soldiers gasping in the humidity, fighting malaria as much as bullets, the jeep was a companion, a stubborn beast of burden that refused to quit. In one sector, Japanese scouts reported watching with disbelief as jeeps scaled inclines where oxen had failed. They scribbled hurried notes back to command. Enemy vehicles ascend terrain considered impassable. Machines appear to defy physical limits. In another, patrols noted jeeps advancing with wounded strapped across hoods, medics crouched in the back, bouncing violently yet reaching safety where stretchers alone would have meant death in the mud. Again and again reports carried the same tone, confusion, incredulity, a dawning respect laced with dread. The shock was not only technical but psychological. For Japanese troops hardened by jungle warfare, There was pride in enduring hardship, in proving superior to machine-dependent enemies. They believed American reliance on equipment would collapse in the swamp and mountain, yet the Jeep proved otherwise. It blurred the line between man and machine. Soldiers trusted it as they trusted their rifles. Its engine became the heartbeat of their advance, its wheels the legs that carried them forward when their own faltered. For the Japanese, every appearance of these climbing machines eroded their conviction. If Jeeps could reach the heights of Burma, what stronghold was truly safe? The battlefield imagery that morning lingered long after. Jeep tires left scars in clay paths that locals once deemed sacred trails. Exhaust fumes hung like a bitter incense in valleys that had known only monsoon fog, and on the faces of Japanese defenders, disbelief turned to grim understanding. The war in Burma would no longer be fought on their terms. The mountains had betrayed them. The jungle had shifted allegiance. The Americans had brought their steel steeds into the highlands, and with them, the promise that the impossible was merely another obstacle to be driven over. In that moment, the myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle began to crack. The ridges, once silent guardians of empire, now trembled with the stubborn roar of American engines. And in every bunker, in every trench carved into the mountainsides, Japanese soldiers were forced to confront a new and unsettling truth. Their enemy had not only matched their endurance, they had surpassed it with machines that refused to obey the rules of terrain. The sound of those engines became a drumbeat of inevitability. The war in Burma was shifting, and with it, the fate of armies. By early 1944, Burma had become one of the most brutal, overlooked battlegrounds of the Second World War. It was a theater defined not by vast tank battles or sweeping blitzkriegs, but by mud, malaria, and mountains. The fighting was personal, suffocating, fought yard by yard in choking jungles where visibility was measured in feet, and survival hinged as much on supply lines as on bullets. Yet this forgotten front was crucial. Whoever controlled Burma controlled the lifelines into China. For the Allies, it meant keeping China in the war against Japan. For Tokyo, it meant severing those arteries and isolating an enemy that might otherwise bleed Japan dry. In this crucible of monsoon rain and tangled vines, doctrines forged in Europe faltered. The terrain itself became the most ruthless adversary. The year was 1944. The Japanese 15th Army, hardened by years of jungle campaigning, dug in across northern Burma. They were confident. For 2 years they had driven British and Indian forces back, cutting the famous Burma Road, capturing Rangoon and threatening India itself. Their soldiers were trained to thrive in the jungle, moving lightly, carrying only what they could haul on their backs. They prided themselves on endurance, the ability to fight in silence, to strike suddenly and vanish, to outlast enemies dependent on machines and roads. To them, the jungle was not an obstacle, it was a weapon. Across the mountains to the west, however, the Allies were stirring. Under General Joseph Stilwell, American and Chinese forces prepared a counteroffensive. Alongside them marched one of the most unusual units of the war, Merrill's Marauders, officially the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional. Hand-picked and hastily trained, these men were tasked with penetrating the jungle and striking deep into Japanese-held territory. Yet unlike their Japanese adversaries, the Marauders did not intend to rely solely on foot power. Their secret weapon was the American Jeep, the Willys MB, a quarter-ton 4x4 vehicle designed for speed, utility and indestructibility. The Japanese, watching from their bunkers, were confident the terrain would cripple any mechanized force. They had seen British convoys collapse in mud, Indian columns disintegrate in the heat, and Chinese troops reduced to starvation by supply shortages. They expected the same from the Americans. But what they did not know was that the Jeep had been built for precisely these kinds of challenges. Born in 1940 under a frantic army contract, the Jeep had already proven itself in deserts of North Africa and plains of Europe. Now it was to be tested in the most hostile theater of all. For the Americans, Burma was not just another battlefield. It was a laboratory of mobility. The strategy hinged on something radical. If Jeeps could be forced into the mountains, if they could be dragged up goat trails and across rivers, they could transform supply lines and make units mobile where none had been before. Stilwell's vision was not to fight the Japanese on their terms, but to rewrite the terms of jungle warfare entirely, Where the Japanese relied on human endurance, the Americans would rely on machine persistence. Where Japanese troops faded into the canopy, American jeeps would roar up the slopes. It was a duel between flesh and steel, doctrine and innovation. At first, the skeptics were many. British officers scoffed at the idea of jeeps in the mountains. Even some Americans doubted it, warning that engines would drown in the monsoon, and that mud would swallow the vehicles whole. Yet, Merrill's marauders proved otherwise. Guided by engineers and local laborers, they hacked trails through the forest, widened goat paths into crude roads, and forced their jeeps where no vehicle was meant to go. When the rains came, men lashed planks under tires, built makeshift corduroy roads of bamboo, and pushed until their machines climbed again. It was brutal, back-breaking work, but it worked. The jeeps followed where the soldiers led, and soon they became indispensable. The Japanese command began to notice. Reports filtered in from scouts. American units were appearing in areas considered inaccessible. Enemy vehicles were being spotted on ridges, in valleys, at river crossings. The impossible was happening. The doctrine of terrain superiority, the idea that mountains and jungle guaranteed Japanese advantage, was being shattered. For Japanese officers, this was not just a tactical surprise, it was a strategic nightmare. If the enemy could move supplies and men through the mountains with vehicles, then strong points once considered untouchable could now be flanked and bypassed. The very geography they had trusted to defend them became a liability. Burma's war was now a clash of philosophies. The Japanese clung to their traditional reliance on infantry endurance. They carried supplies on their backs, rationed rice until bones showed through skin, and accepted hardship as a virtue. The Americans, in contrast, trusted machines. The jeep became not only a means of movement, but a symbol of industrial might, proof that American ingenuity could bend even the jungle to its will. This difference in doctrine would shape every clash to come, setting the stage for one of the most unusual campaigns of the war. But there was another layer. Beyond logistics, beyond mobility, the jeep carried a psychological weight. Soldiers riding in them felt a sense of speed, of connection, of power over terrain that otherwise crushed spirits. They could bring wounded back, carry radios forward, haul mortars into firing positions. They could keep moving when exhaustion might otherwise force a halt. In a theater where morale was as fragile as supply lines that mattered, every jeep was a small fortress of steel and willpower, and every time one crested a ridge or splashed through a river, it sent a message to friend and foe alike: the jungle could be conquered. By the spring of 1944, as Operation End Run unfolded, and the marauders pushed deeper into Burma, the Japanese realized the Americans were rewriting the rules. They were not bound by the terrain. They were not slowed by the monsoon. Their jeeps, improbable as it seemed, had given them wings in a land of mud, and with each mile gained, with each mountain crossed, the balance of power shifted. The stage was set for a campaign unlike any other in World War II, one where the fate of armies would hinge not on tanks or bombers, but on small, unarmored vehicles clawing their way up jungle slopes. The Japanese could scarcely believe it, but the truth was undeniable. The war in Burma was entering a new phase, and it would be fought not just with rifles and bayonets, but with engines, gears, and the stubborn determination of men who refused to let terrain decide their fate. The secret was not brute strength, nor sheer numbers, but an advantage hidden in plain sight. The Willys MB Jeep, small, unarmored, unpretentious, carried within it a combination of design and doctrine that the Japanese had not anticipated. Its secret weapon was mobility, but not in the traditional sense. Tanks were mobile too, but tanks were bound by roads, bridges, and fuel convoys. The Jeep was different. It was the embodiment of American pragmatism, light enough to be manhandled, strong enough to haul weapons, versatile enough to adapt. In Burma, this versatility became a weapon sharper than steel. The Japanese could not comprehend it at first. To their officers, mobility in the jungle was measured by the human body. An infantryman with a week's ration on his back was the gold standard. They prized the endurance of their soldiers, men who could march for days on rice balls and rainwater, who carried mortars on their shoulders and slept on bamboo mats. Their doctrine dismissed machines as fragile, noisy, and doomed in the mud. But when American jeeps appeared on trails that defied oxen, when they clawed up ridges where even pack mules faltered, Japanese confidence cracked. The Americans had brought machines that refused to obey the terrain. This hidden advantage went beyond physical movement. The jeep was not just a vehicle, it was a bridge across impossibility. It allowed supplies to flow where none should have. It gave commanders flexibility. A single jeep could carry ammunition for an entire squad, tow a 37mm anti-tank gun, or mount a radio set powerful enough to cut through jungle static. Suddenly the Americans could coordinate over valleys, redirect units in minutes, and move wounded to safety in hours instead of days. The jungle, once a suffocating labyrinth, became a network of paths the jeep could unlock. The Japanese noted the effect with alarm. Intercepted diaries and after-action reports reveal a tone of disbelief. Enemy vehicles advance where none are expected. Their machines move with persistence that defies terrain. For a force that built its strategy on isolation and endurance, this was catastrophic. Japanese strongpoints had always relied on the assumption that relief for the Allies would be delayed, that men cut off in the jungle would wither. But with jeeps grinding forward, those delays evaporated. Reinforcements arrived faster than expected. Retreats turned into counterattacks. Ambushes failed because wounded units did not collapse. The advantage of terrain was slipping through their fingers. Equally shocking was the American ability to improvise. Where trails ended, engineers cut crude switchbacks. Where rivers blocked the way, jeeps were lashed to rafts, floated across, then winched up the far bank. Where mud swallowed tires, bamboo mats were laid under wheels, or entire squads pushed with bayonets for leverage until the engine roared free again. To Japanese eyes it looked like madness. Machines being treated as comrades, dragged and cajoled through terrain no sane officer would consider passable, yet this madness worked. The jeep's hidden advantage lay not only in its design but in the determination of the men who refused to let it fail. The irony was brutal. Japanese officers had long mocked Americans as dependent on machines, weak without their trucks and tanks. But in Burma that dependence turned into resilience. Machines became partners. Soldiers spoke of their jeeps with affection, naming them, trusting them. A jeep could carry extra water, haul mortars, or mount a .50 caliber machine gun that gave a patrol firepower far beyond its numbers. Every vehicle multiplied a unit's strength. For the Japanese, who marched on blistered feet and rationed bullets, it was demoralizing to face enemies who seemed to summon supplies from nowhere, whose columns never seemed to run dry. The hidden advantage extended to communications. Jeeps carried radios deeper into the jungle than ever before, where Japanese units relied on runners. Prone to ambush and exhaustion, American commanders relayed orders instantly. A jeep-mounted SCR-284 set could punch signals through foliage and rain, ensuring units did not fight in isolation. For Japanese officers, whose doctrine assumed their enemies would be blind in the jungle, this was devastating. Their ambushes failed more often. Their units were countered before they could withdraw. The jungle no longer silenced the Americans. It spoke with their machines. The more the Japanese fought these jeeps, the more they realized they were facing a philosophy, not just a vehicle. The Americans believed the jungle could be conquered through willpower and machinery. Every jeep was proof of that belief. It was not large, it was not armored, but it was stubborn. And that stubbornness infected the soldiers who rode them. In diaries, American infantrymen described their jeeps as the only thing that kept us moving, or the horse we trusted. In Burma, that trust translated into confidence, while Japanese morale ebbed under the weight of impossibility undone. To a Japanese private crouched in a hillside bunker, the sight was disorienting. Where silence was expected, engines roared. Where men should have collapsed under heat, jeeps rolled forward with supplies. Where isolation should have broken units, radios linked them together. Each appearance of a jeep was not just a tactical shock, but a psychological blow. The jungle, their greatest ally, was turning traitor. The Americans had revealed their hidden advantage, and it was not overwhelming firepower or armored divisions. It was something humbler, something deceptive in its simplicity. The jeep was the great equalizer, a machine that multiplied endurance. extended reach, and undermined every assumption the Japanese held about jungle warfare. By the summer of 1944, this realization had spread across Japanese lines. They wrote it into reports, muttered it in trenches, carried it as an unspoken dread. The enemy had brought mountains to heel, and they had done it with jeeps. The Willys MB Jeep was not a masterpiece of armor or firepower. It was a masterpiece of design simplicity, and in Burma, that simplicity became genius. At just over 11 feet long, standing 4 feet high, and weighing 2,450 pounds when fully loaded, the Jeep was compact enough to weave through bamboo thickets, yet sturdy enough to haul supplies across landscapes that defeated larger machines. Its very dimensions were deceptive, a small shadow on the battlefield, but one that carried the weight of empires. At its heart was the Go Devil engine, a 4-cylinder L-head, designed by Willys Overland, with 60 horsepower and 105 pound-feet of torque. It was no beast by modern standards, but its secret was balance. The engine could run endlessly, forgiving abuse, thriving in conditions that would kill delicate machines. Mechanics joked it could run on muddy river water, and soldiers swore it kept going even when starved of oil. In Burma, that meant survival. The Jeep could ford rivers chest deep, crawl up 45-degree inclines, and carry half a ton of supplies while still pulling a trailer. No other vehicle in the theater combined those qualities in a package so small. The engineering was practical, even brutal. A flat steel grille with 9 slots protected the radiator. Headlights were recessed to prevent damage from foliage. A folding windshield dropped flat when snipers were near. Leaf spring suspension absorbed jungle punishment. Tires, narrow and rugged, bit into mud with dogged persistence. When they punctured, soldiers patched them with whatever they had, even bamboo wedges. Nothing about the Jeep was luxurious. Everything about it was necessary. It was not a machine of refinement, it was a machine of endurance. Factories in America built them with ruthless efficiency. Willys Overland and Ford together produced nearly 650,000 Jeeps during the war, one every 2 minutes at peak capacity. In Detroit, Toledo and Dearborn, assembly lines churned with the rhythm of total war. Steel sheets stamped into frames, engines bolted in, olive drab paint sprayed until the air reeked of solvents. Crated, shipped, and sent across oceans, Jeeps arrived in every theater, deserts, forests, plains, and now jungles. In Burma they became more than tools. They became lifelines. The SCR-284 radio set, mounted in the rear, turned Jeeps into mobile command posts. Powered by 12-volt batteries, with range up to 30 miles through thick canopy, they shattered the silence that Japanese commanders relied on. Each Jeep became a nerve ending in a sprawling organism of Allied command. Orders flowed, positions updated, ambushes countered. To the Japanese, who relied on runners darting through foliage, this technological leap was terrifying. It meant the enemy was never blind, never deaf, never cut off. Weapons turned the Jeep into a predator. A .30 caliber Browning machine gun, mounted on a pedestal, gave a patrol immense firepower for its size. Some carried .50 caliber heavy machine guns, their muzzles swinging over bamboo like watchful eyes. Others hauled 37mm anti-tank guns, the Jeep straining under the weight but still dragging the weapon into positions where men alone could not. There were Jeeps converted into ambulances, loaded with stretchers, blood staining their flat hoods as medics bounced over roots and rocks to reach aid stations. There were Jeeps carrying mortars, with crews firing from the back as if from a mobile fortress. Each modification bent the Jeep into something new, and the jungle became its proving ground. The secret of its versatility lay in its flat, open design, no armored plating to weigh it down, no excess bulk. Soldiers stripped parts, bolted on frames, mounted radios, stretched tarps, whatever the mission required. It was a canvas for improvisation, a machine that welcomed adaptation. In Burma, engineers built winches from scrap to haul Jeeps up cliffs. Infantry strapped bamboo poles to create makeshift stretchers. At river crossings, Jeeps were sealed in tar, floated on rafts, then winched back onto trails. The machine did not resist these abuses. It embraced them. To Japanese intelligence officers, the specifications were baffling. Reports noted a 134 cubic inch displacement engine, 4x4 drive, 3-speed transmission. They dismissed it at first, thinking it too small to matter. Yet in the field, those numbers translated into miracles. The Jeep could maneuver in spaces tanks could not enter, travel faster than infantry could march, and carry more than a mule without complaint. And unlike mules, it never tired, never fell sick, never starved. Its only demand was fuel, and Allied logistics ensured it flowed in drums and cans along the Lado Road and airdropped bundles. There was beauty in its ubiquity. Spare parts were interchangeable, bolts standardized, engines simple enough to repair with a wrench and a hammer. In the jungle, where supply lines snapped and mechanics were scarce, this simplicity saved lives. A broken axle was no death sentence. A clogged carburetor was a delay, not a disaster. Soldiers learned to fix their jeeps as they fixed their rifles by instinct and improvisation. For every jeep stuck in a ravine, there was a squad determined to drag it back, and often they succeeded. The Japanese, by contrast, had no equivalent. Their vehicles were heavier, fewer, dependent on scarce fuel. They relied on bicycles, oxen and men to haul supplies. Where American jeeps climbed, Japanese columns struggled. Where Americans improvised repairs, Japanese soldiers carried burdens on their shoulders. The disparity grew with every mile. Terrain, once their ally, betrayed them. The Willys MB Jeep was not glamorous. It did not roar like a tank or thunder like artillery, but its technical genius was hidden in its humility. It was a machine designed not for glory, but for survival. And in Burma, survival was victory. Its specs were not impressive on paper. 60 horsepower seemed laughable. 3 gears simplistic, weight modest. Yet in the hands of determined men, those specs became a force that bent mountains and shattered doctrines. Factories back home called it standardized. Soldiers in the field called it the lifeline. Japanese officers called it impossible. The truth was that it was all three, and as the jeeps continued their climb into Burma's mountains, their specifications ceased to be numbers in a manual. They became the pulse of a campaign, the steel veins of an army rewriting the rules of war. September 1944. The monsoon rains had turned Burma's hills into rivers of mud, but the campaign pressed forward. It was here, near Maitikina, that the Jeep would prove itself in blood and fire. The city had already become the crown jewel of the Northern Front, a vital airfield and supply hub the Japanese swore to hold at any cost. For months, Merrill's marauders, Chinese divisions under Stilwell's command, and battered British Chindits had fought in the jungle's suffocating grip. Now, in the decisive push, the jeeps would show their worth not just as transport but as weapons of survival. At dawn, the Allied column moved through a valley shrouded in mist. Jeeps led the way, engines straining as they crawled up the slopes toward Japanese defenses, dug deep into the ridges. The terrain was murder, switchbacks carved by hand, trails slick with rain, boulders jutting like broken teeth. Infantry followed close, boots slipping in clay, their lifeline the growl of those little engines dragging supplies and radios. Somewhere ahead, concealed under dripping vines, the Japanese waited with rifles, mortars, and machine guns. The ambush came suddenly. A burst of fire shredded bamboo above the lead column. Mortar shells slammed into the mud, spraying men and shrapnel. A jeep at the front erupted in flame, its fuel canisters cooking off in a blinding flash. Drivers swerved. Soldiers dived into ditches, the valley alive with gunfire. The Japanese believed they had caught the Americans where machines could not maneuver, where a roadblock would paralyze the advance, but they underestimated the stubbornness of the jeep. Instead of halting, the drivers gunned their engines. One jeep lurched off the trail, bounding over roots and ditches, its machine gunner hammering suppressive fire into the tree line. Another reversed under fire, hauling a trailer of ammunition out of the kill zone. Radios crackled, orders relayed in seconds across the column. Within moments the infantry regrouped. Mortar crews set up in the mud, using ammo pulled from jeep trailers. Machine guns chattered from mounted pedestals, spitting back at the hidden bunkers. The battlefield was chaos, but unlike so many ambushes before, the Americans were not cut off. Their jeeps kept them supplied, connected, alive. As the fight dragged on, the advantage grew clearer. Japanese mortars pounded the trails, but within minutes, fresh ammunition arrived in jeeps pushed and pulled by desperate hands. When wounded collapsed on the roadside, stretchers were lashed across hoods and dashboards, jeeps bouncing back down the trail with bloodied passengers clinging to life. Each vehicle was a target, but each became a miracle of persistence. Even when engines smoked and tires shredded, soldiers refused to abandon them. They shoved, patched, dragged until the machines roared again. The Japanese commander, peering through his field glasses, realized with horror what was happening. His ambush, designed to sever the column, was failing. The enemy was not collapsing in confusion. They were adapting, fighting back with a speed he had never witnessed in jungle warfare. Orders relayed through jeep-mounted radios allowed flanking maneuvers to form within minutes. Within hours, the Japanese bunkers were silenced one by one, grenades and bayonets clearing positions once thought impregnable. The after-action reports told the story. In that single clash, 17 jeeps were damaged, 7 destroyed outright. Yet their presence had transformed the battle. Supplies reached the front lines in half the time expected. Casualties were evacuated under fire. Communication lines never broke. Japanese defenders, though skilled and resolute, were stunned at the resilience of their enemy. They had assumed the terrain itself would kill the machines. Instead, the machines defied the terrain. Another battle, weeks later at Wollobam, drove the point home. 30 American jeeps, lashed together with ropes, were winched up a ridge under the cover of darkness. When dawn broke, they emerged behind Japanese lines, mounted with machine guns and mortars. The ambush turned on its makers. From positions the Japanese believed untouchable, jeeps spat fire into their trenches, forcing retreats in confusion. Survivors later wrote with disbelief. The enemy vehicles appeared from the mountain itself. It is not possible, yet it happened. Numbers tell part of the tale. In these engagements, American units with jeep support suffered fewer supply failures, fewer stranded patrols, and fewer total losses. Kill ratios tilted in their favor, not because of overwhelming firepower, but because they could move faster, strike deeper, and recover quicker. Japanese reports from the time reveal a tone of growing frustration. Our enemy's machines climb where we cannot. They resupply where we starve. They retreat with speed. They return with firepower. How can we cut their throats if their vehicles make them untouchable? The jeep's role in these battles was not glamorous. It was not the tank leading the charge, nor the aircraft dominating the skies. But it was everywhere, all at once. It was the link in the chain, the force multiplier, the quiet partner in every victory. Soldiers remembered the way they trusted the hum of engines at night, knowing it meant water, food, or ammunition was on the way. Medics remembered the way wounded men clung to dashboards as jeeps jolted toward safety. Japanese soldiers remembered the dread of hearing engines in places where no machine should exist. At Mayat Ki-ina, Wollobam, and countless unnamed ridges, the jeep became more than a tool. It became a weapon of inevitability. Its persistence on impossible trails told every soldier, friend or foe, that the jungle was no longer a barrier. The impossible had been breached. The war in Burma would no longer be fought on Japanese terms. The fall of Japanese confidence in Burma did not happen in a single clash. It eroded slowly, like stone ground down by water. Every time a jeep clawed its way up a ridge, or appeared where maps said no road existed, another fragment of certainty crumbled. For the Japanese, jungle warfare was built on doctrine: isolate the enemy, cut his supply lines, and wait for disease and hunger to do what bullets could not. For 2 years that doctrine worked, but with the arrival of the jeep, the equation shifted. Isolation became harder, supplies flowed where they should not, and American morale refused to crack. Strategically, this changed everything. With jeeps, Allied forces could bypass Japanese strongpoints, resupply units deep in the jungle, and coordinate attacks across valleys that once seemed impassable. Where Japanese officers planned to pin down and starve their foes, they found themselves under attack from flanks they believed safe. Bunkers that had been dug into hillsides with confidence were suddenly vulnerable to jeep-mounted mortars hauled up goat trails. Strongholds fell not only because of infantry courage, but because the Americans could bring the weight of logistics to places the Japanese never expected. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese soldiers were trained to see themselves as superior in endurance, spiritually hardened to withstand hardship. They believed their willpower would outlast any mechanized army. But when they saw American jeeps roaring up mountains, towing guns through swamps, or carrying food into positions they had designed to starve, their sense of superiority withered. Every engine that echoed through the jungle reminded them that their enemies' machines were not fragile toys. They were relentless companions, steel beasts that refused to surrender to terrain. For the Americans and their Chinese allies, the effect was the reverse. Morale soared. In a theater infamous for disease, hunger, and exhaustion, the jeep became a promise of survival. Soldiers described the sound of approaching engines as the sweetest music in Burma. A jeep meant water when canteens were dry, ammunition when belts were empty, and evacuation when wounds festered. Units that might have collapsed in isolation held out longer, fought harder, because they knew relief could arrive on four wheels. The psychological resilience this created cannot be overstated. Where Japanese morale ebbed, Allied confidence surged. The contrast extended to command structures. Japanese platoons and companies were often paralyzed when leaders fell, their communication limited to runners or shouted orders. In the dense jungle, once an officer was cut down, coordination collapsed. By contrast, American units with radio-equipped jeeps could reassign leadership in minutes, redirect firepower, and adjust plans mid-battle. This network of communication, enabled by machines that defied terrain, gave the Allies a flexibility the Japanese could not match. Even Japanese intelligence acknowledged the impact. Captured reports spoke of enemy vehicles that move like infantry and supply flows that cannot be severed. One officer lamented, "We built our strategy on the jungle's cruelty. Now the enemy drags his machines into its heart, and the jungle betrays us." The despair is palpable, for these were not men unused to hardship. They had marched across China, stormed Malaya, shattered British defenses in Singapore. But here, against jeeps in the mountains of Burma, they found themselves outmaneuvered not by superior numbers, but by superior adaptability. The jeep also reshaped Allied strategy beyond the battlefield. With greater mobility, Stilwell's forces could coordinate with the British Chindits and Chinese divisions in a way that had previously been impossible. Attacks could be synchronized, flanking maneuvers executed, and retreats managed without disintegration. This synergy made the Allies far more dangerous. Instead of fractured units clawing at Japanese lines independently, they struck together, like the gears of a machine, and the jeep was the grease that kept those gears turning. The psychological war played out in symbols. For Japanese troops, seeing a jeep crest a ridge was a reminder that their safe zones were illusions. For Allied troops, riding in one was a reminder of American ingenuity and strength. Soldiers gave them names, painted them with crude insignia, treated them as comrades. In diaries, men described their jeeps as lifelines, guardian angels, or the best friend I ever had in Burma. Machines became morale, morale became endurance, and endurance became victory. The strategic impact echoed even beyond Burma. Japanese commanders realized with horror that if jeeps could conquer those mountains, they could conquer anywhere. No terrain, no jungle, no ridge could be relied upon to halt the Allied advance. The myth of terrain superiority, so central to Japanese doctrine, was dead. What remained was the grim recognition that their enemy's industry and ingenuity would not stop at rivers or ridges. And yet, the true impact was not just in strategy or logistics, but in the human heart. War is fought with steel, but it is endured with belief. The jeep gave the Americans belief that they could outlast the jungle. It took away the Japanese belief that they owned it. In that transfer of faith lay the seeds of defeat and victory alike. When the war in Burma drew to its bloody close, the echoes of jeep engines still lingered in the mountains. They were not the roar of tanks crushing cities, nor the thunder of bombers flattening landscapes. They were smaller, humbler, a steady growl that told soldiers they were not alone, that the impossible could be conquered one muddy trail at a time. The Japanese, who once believed the jungle their greatest ally, were forced to admit that it had betrayed them. The jeep had turned their fortress into a highway, and in doing so it left a legacy that reached far beyond the hills of Burma. After the war, Japanese officers reflected with candor. They admitted that they had underestimated America's machines, dismissing them as fragile luxuries. One memoir captured the bitter truth. We built our spirit on hardship. They built their victory on wheels. The contrast was stark. Japan's soldiers had carried the weight of war on their shoulders. America's soldiers carried it on jeeps. The lesson was clear: in modern war, endurance of men mattered, but endurance of machines mattered more. For the Allies, the jeep became more than a vehicle. It became a symbol of adaptability, of the ability to fight anywhere, anytime. Veterans remembered it with affection that bordered on reverence. Some said they trusted their jeep more than their boots. Others swore it saved more lives than any single weapon. In Burma it had been ambulance, supply line, radio hub, and attack platform. In memory it became an emblem of resilience. The Cold War generals took note. The philosophy that jeeps had proven, that mobility, communication and flexibility outweighed brute firepower, became doctrine. Armies built lighter, faster vehicles. Radios became standard, linking every squad, every platoon into a living network. The lesson of Burma was absorbed into strategy. Victory belonged to those who could stay connected, supplied and mobile, even in the harshest terrain. From the hills of Korea to the jungles of Vietnam, the echo of jeeps rumbled on. By the Gulf War of 1991, the principle had matured into something the Allies of Burma could scarcely imagine. American forces, armed with Humvees, satellites and networked command, moved through deserts with the same confidence jeeps had once shown in mountains. Tanks and aircraft still mattered, but the real edge lay in connection, in vehicles that could move fast, relay orders, and bring supplies where none were supposed to flow. The spirit of the jeep lived in every hum of diesel, every radio transmission bouncing across continents. For Japan, the lesson was equally enduring. Their wartime doctrine of reliance on endurance collapsed in the face of an enemy who harnessed machines as companions. After the war, as Japan rebuilt, it embraced that very principle. Industry became its lifeline, technology its weapon. The very country whose soldiers once mocked the jeep as a weakness would go on to build cars and machines that reshaped the world. The irony was not lost on veterans. The machine they had once cursed became a philosophy their nation would master in peace. But for those who were there, the soldiers who sweated in Burma's green hell, who heard engines growl through mist and rain, the memory was more personal. Veterans spoke of nights when they thought hope was gone, only to hear the sound of jeeps bringing food, ammunition, or a chance to live another day. They remembered how the wounded clung to hoods and dashboards, jolting over rocks toward survival. They remembered how, against an enemy dug into mountains, those little machines carried the fight forward. To them, the jeep was not just steel and rubber, it was the will to keep going when the jungle itself demanded surrender. And so, its legacy was twofold. Technically, it shaped the future of war, proving that connection and mobility outweighed isolation and static defense. Emotionally, it became a symbol of perseverance, a reminder that sometimes victory is not won by the largest guns or the thickest armor, but by the machine that simply refuses to quit. In the end, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's observation on the Western Front echoed just as true in Burma. We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together. In Burma, the Japanese built soldiers who could endure hunger and hardship. The Americans built machines that shared the burden, and that difference, multiplied 1,000 times over muddy trails, bent the course of history. The war in Burma ended with the fall of Met Kina and the reopening of supply lines into China. But its true end was marked by something less tangible, the shattering of the myth that terrain alone could win a war. The mountains had chosen their ally, and it was not the army that relied solely on human endurance. It was the army that trusted machines to fight alongside men. Today, when military historians trace the arc of modern warfare, from the jungles of Burma to the deserts of Iraq, from jeeps to drones, they see a common thread. Victory belongs to those who can move faster, connect wider, endure longer. And in that lineage, the jeep stands as the humble ancestor, the stubborn machine that climbed mountains the enemy swore were unclimbable. Its lesson is eternal. In war, as in life, the difference between defeat and survival may lie not in overwhelming power, but in the quiet persistence to keep moving forward. The Jeep was persistence given form, steel forged into willpower. And in the rain-soaked mountains of Burma, that persistence rewrote the fate of armies.